Das ist Kunst. Der Podcast der Deichtorhallen Hamburg.
Der US-amerikanische Fotokünstler Paul Mpagi Sepuya ist einer von 2 KünstlerInnen in der aktuellen Ausstellung im Foxy, dem temporären Haus der Fotografie der Deichtorhallen Hamburg. Bis zum 26. Februar ist Daylight Studio, Darkroom Studio, so der Titel der von Sepuya ausgestellten Werke, zu sehen. Neben der Installation Sticks der französischen Künstlerin Alex Marie. In Paul Mpagi Sepuyas Fotografien wird das Künstlerstudio als Bühne und Teil des künstlerischen Prozesses erkundet. Sepuya erweitert die üblichen Definitionen des Studios. Seine Porträtfotografie zeigt das Studio als Ort queerer Netzwerke und Kollaboration, als Möglichkeitsraum der Homoerotik und reflektiert die eigenen Positionierungen als Künstler und Subjekt in seinen Fotos. Porträtfotografie, die allerdings nie mit gebuchten Modellen arbeitet, sondern Sepuyas erweiterten Freundeskreis, KünstlerInnen, KollegInnen oder Bekannte aus seiner queeren Community zeigt und dabei nicht frontal abbildet, sondern die Beziehungen zwischen Künstler und Porträtiertem neu auslotet. Spiegel, Requisiten, Fingerabdrücke und ein schwarzer Vorhang sind weitere Protagonisten in den Daylight Studio-Arbeiten Sepuyas. Er unterstreicht die Bedeutung von Schwarzsein anhand ihrer materiellen und konzeptuellen Rolle in der Fotografie. Der schwarze Vorhang, ein Arbeitsmaterial, das aus der Fotografie nicht wegzudenken ist, oder seine eigene schwarze Haut werden in Sepuyas Werken zur Bedingung der Sichtbarkeit von Spuren, die vor weißem Hintergrund unsichtbar bleiben. Daylight Studio. Der Titel dieser Arbeiten ist angelehnt an Sepuyas Interesse an Tageslichtateliers aus dem 19. Jahrhundert und der Geschichte des KünstlerInnenstudios im 19. und frühen 20. Jahrhundert. In seinen Darkroom-Studio-Fotografien untersucht Sepuya die Zweideutigkeit des Darkroom und die parallelen Bedeutungsebenen zwischen dem Darkroom, der Dunkelkammer in der Fotografie, und dem sozialen Ort, dem Darkroom in queeren Nachtclubs als Ort sexueller Begegnungen. Ich habe mit Paul Mpagi Sepuya über seine Anfänge und Inspirationsquellen gesprochen. Darüber, wie der Hauptschauplatz seiner Werke, sein Studio, entstanden ist und von historischen Ateliers beeinflusst ist. Und natürlich darüber, wie die Foto-Dunkelkammer und der queere Darkroom zusammenhängen. Das Gespräch wurde auf Englisch geführt. Es wird von einigen deutschsprachigen kurzen Kontextualisierungen unterbrochen. What got you into photography? Like, what made you choose to study it, for example?
When did I get into photography?
When did you get your first camera?
The first camera was, I think the first camera was maybe a Polaroid camera that I got when I was 13, 14. But it was so long ago, I don't remember. Maybe around then. I think it was for a birthday present. I may have asked for one, but I don't know why. I could maybe ask my mom if she remembers why I asked for one. Just to take little silly pictures, gather little objects around the house and make snapshots, like little funny still lives of things. I can't remember if I was taking pictures of any friends or anything like that. I don't think I was. But then at some point I took a photo class in high school at, it wasn't at my school, but it was at the University of California, Riverside, UC Riverside. And it was like a summer photo class, like an intro to black and white, an introductory photo class, which of course that time in the 90s is always an analog class. So I learned how to develop and process film and make prints and things like that. Yeah, so that was how I kind of really got into it. A neighbor across the street this family that we were close with, the father was a photographer. And so we set up an enlarger, you know, basically made on one of those like bench, like a tool, like a garage tool bench. Is that what it's called?
I think so. I know what you mean.
Yeah. Just kind of cleared off this area, maybe the size of this desk that you're sitting at, to make a little garage darkroom, you know, just close the lights, like, you know, block the doors.
Very
and
DIY darkroom.
Yeah. So that was kind of fun and did a lot of experiments and things.
Did you have any early on, like, role models in photography that you kind of thought, this is really interesting and it makes me want to, like, try to do something in that direction?
I mean, honestly, it was Andy Warhol and David LaChapelle.
But that's a good answer. I mean, why not?
Yeah. And that's what, you know, I was kind of really set on. It was just very captivating, you know.
Right.
I was just like voraciously consuming magazines, anything I could get my hands on at like the magazine stands in Santa Monica and Hollywood. You know, going to all the, you know, the mall bookshops and finding underground places. You were going to say?
I was going to say, yeah, because this is a time. I mean, I remember that time too, where, you know, the internet was not the place where you would go first to look for stuff like that. You know, you would have to go to the magazines. I mean, in the 90s or early, well, I mean, up till the early 2000s, you know, it was there where you would find visual inspiration, right?
Yeah. You know, and so there's, like, I'd already had a subscription to Interview magazine by maybe 1996 or something. Interview, Vibe, Spin, The Face, ID, all of these things. But then there was also, like, you know, sneaking around and finding the gay porno magazines and things. Also, there's a lot of, like, the gay magazines. Yeah, at the same time, I had subscriptions to just, like, you know, the basic U.S. gay magazines. Also, since I was a teenager, you could kind of, like, discover art through them in a way too, because they had a kind of art coverage. And, you know, that was the time there were a lot of, like, very iconic David LaChapelle shoots in that. Same thing for, like, Vibe and Rolling Stone and Spin. So they were just very flashy. And then I think I'd also, like, found Bruce LaBruce.
So you
were like the bargain bin VHS tapes. You know, it's like, what is this?
Kind of diving into the intersection of pop culture, music, fashion, photography, gay culture, you know, queer aesthetics, that spoke to you kind of.
Yeah. So I don't know what I thought being an artist was. I just wanted to take pictures like that, which I don't do at all. But that's what I went to school trying to do as like an 18-year-old.
Let's fast forward a little bit to the exhibition at Deichtorhallen and the Foxy, and also to your own studio that you have had for, I think you said, for 7 years now in Los Angeles. All your work in the exhibition features your studio, was shot in your studio. And you mentioned that this relates to your interest in historic 19th and early 20th century artist studios. In what ways did that artist studio transition? What interests you in that?
The interest in 19th and early 20th century artist studios is something that's new, just in the past maybe 2 years. But I've been in this studio building since 6 years, and I was in one space initially with my friend Nikita Gale, who's an amazing artist. And we had divided the space up, and I used one side and she used one side. And then she moved to a different studio, and I kind of took over both sides. And that was kind of the first time I had a whole area that I could just use for making photographs, and another side that I could put everything else, desk, computer, and that really kind of expanded things. But I had made work in a studio before where I started for the first time having a relationship to photography that wasn't like set up some lights and a camera, a friend sits down, make some portraits, you pack up everything. I take my film to the lab, I process it, or get it processed, then I go make some prints, you look at them on the board in the lab, and then you put them in a portfolio box and they kind of sit under your bed until that occasion when you bring them out for people to look at. But to what it meant to just have, it was the first time I also started using a digital camera for the first time then, that summer of 2009. Photographing in that space again, like, day after day, and it kind of became this cumulative process. So that kind of started during that month, and that really changed everything.
Im ersten Drittel des 19. Jahrhunderts erlebte das Artist Studio, das Atelier, als Ort der Inspiration und Teil des künstlerischen Prozesses eine Aufwertung. Es gab ein neues Interesse am Ursprungsort der Kunst, das unter anderem erste Bemühungen nach sich zog, die Häuser berühmter MalerInnen und BildhauerInnen allgemein zugänglich zu machen. Die Künstlerstudios aus Mitte des 19. und Anfang des 20. Jahrhunderts waren oft gefüllt mit Objekten und Sammelsurien, die in unmittelbarer Verbindung zu Kolonialismus und Imperialismus standen. Teppiche, Podeste, Säulen, Skulpturen, Kissen, Stühle, zusammengewürfelte Objekte, die Paul Mpagi Sepuya während seines Umzugs in ein größeres Studio angesammelt hat, werden in seinen Fotos oft zu Statisten, die eine Geschichte erzählen. Sein Studio ist für Sepuya nicht bloß Arbeitsplatz oder Stellfläche, sondern ein Raum, der die verschiedenen Zeit- und Bedeutungsebenen seiner Werke enthält.
So I wasn't looking at the history of artist studios at all. I was just looking at what happens when this space becomes filled with things that are currently in process, fragments of things that are yet to be resolved, and then to make a portrait in that space surrounded by all these other fragments, how people start to reflect and mirror each other. And I was more interested, I wasn't thinking about the history of them, but I was really thinking about
maybe how the studio becomes like a part of your whole process and not just a room that you go to?
Yeah. And that idea of the artist studio as this place that holds multiple tenses of time became like a way of sort of understanding that. Somewhere in that process, I started gathering the first sorts of props in the space. Like I had these benches, but those benches were left over from a fellow classmate's thesis project, and so those became like a recurring object in the space. The first fabric that I got was mostly the fabric that I took was this gold shimmery kind of fabric that reminded me of the sort of like fabric that a 1940s like film star would have, in a dress for like an early film premiere or whatever. And I was thinking about all these things and how they reminded me of like the 1930s to 1940s early Vogue Harper's Bazaar stage setting that got repurposed for like all of the gay and like homoerotic male nudes and things that they would do. And so that's the first time I started thinking about the history of the objects in studios.
The studio props and tools that are visible sometimes in your pictures, pillars, chairs, pillows, sculpture, all those things that you just mentioned, they become a part of the pictures. And I was just wondering if that's something that you also kind of intend to re-signify some of those objects that, in history, certain objects in a photo studio might have been responsible to show, traits of a colonial history, for example, or, some kind of inheritance from that time, but like resignifying it and also being like, this is not just a prop in my studio, it's there, and so it's part of my work. Is that something you have thought about too, and concerning, bringing these props and your studio interior into your art?
Yeah. So, I think this body of work is the first one that I think really has props that are like thinking about specific periods in time or references. As I started thinking about that space and how to photograph it, COVID kind of intervened, and then I was moved studios within the building, but to a larger space that I could then reconfigure. And I was like, okay, now how do I want to fill this space? And in that time, I was just looking at a lot of I was like, okay, let's start looking at the history of these studios. And I was looking at the objects that were in them. And I'm like, okay, there's like Chinese vases filled with palms. There are plaster cast reproductions of Greco-Roman busts. There are furs. There are pedestals. There are fabrics and rugs that come from, North Africa and Central Asia. And, all of this, I kind of just started pinning the images of them up, and I started getting some rugs. I was like, let me get some rugs. And just bit by bit, I started adding a few things in. The kind of turning point was when I found this, when I found a couple of things, these pedestals, these walnut pedestals that come from Paris, from an artist studio in 1870. And then there was, from a similar time period, a sculptural wooden stool from Mali. And then I started acquiring fans and other things. But your question about repurposing them, they constructed like a setting. And it was interesting, as I was mostly there by myself. It was COVID, so I wasn't photographing that many people. I have a part-time studio manager who helps sort of like maintain things, but he wasn't really there. So I was doing all of this sort of like maintenance work and arranging things. And I was thinking about, okay, how do I relate to this space? I'd never thought about relating to 19th century photographs. But at the same time, I was looking at these images of F. Hollandaise, these photographs of this man who for a long time wasn't really acknowledged, but his name is J. Alexandre Skeet, who is like a friend, mentor, and model for Hollandaise. And he's sort of posed with all of these objects. And I was thinking about like this work as a model, but also his learning about his biography and that he was a janitor. He was an artist, but the only employment he could get was as a janitor, and thinking about him maintaining these sorts of spaces. I just began by photographing myself as I was sort of, and it's not that doesn't become as apparent in the resulting images, but that's sort of like
your thought
what's
process.
Going on in the setting up of those. But all these objects that are about like, they're like all very pleasurable. That's when I started photographing myself. I began by photographing myself just laying amongst the pillows, thinking about, making images of me both moving and setting up and maintaining the space, and then along with just the possibility of like a black subject that's just relaxing, but not modeling, not doing I don't know, it's specific things like the tools. I brought those in because I was looking at discovered these images of him gardening, because so many people were at various amateur professions, thinking about the ways in which certain tools, like tools of labor, become kind of like props for homoerotic photographs later on. And it still is a huge thing, right? It's like the tool of labor is like a prop for like, the construction person or the right. the plumber or whatever it is. But, there's a lot of these photographs of him doing this kind of like leisurely version of what would otherwise be like backbreaking work for someone who actually had to depend on the land. And so I have these tools that I found in the basement of my house from 1910 that I brought to the studio, and thinking about, and then using those as props, but also then posing several white friends with them in this sort of reference, but thinking about it like in a reverse of like the F. Holland Day way of posing J.
And just to ask or put that into context really quick, F. Holland Day, if I'm correct, is seen as kind of like a pioneer in like gay portraiture and that kind of sense. Am I right?
Yeah.
Der US-amerikanische Fotograf F. Holland Day und seine für Ende des 19., Anfang des 20. Jahrhunderts unkonventionellen, homoerotischen Nacktbildserien haben einen starken Eindruck auf Paul hinterlassen. Alexander Skeet wiederum war schwarz, selbst Künstler und taucht als Muse immer wieder in F. Holland Days Fotografien künstlerisch inszeniert auf. Skeet war die Ausübung von Berufen aufgrund seiner Hautfarbe massiv erschwert worden. Und die einzige Stelle, die er gefunden hatte, war die eines Hauswarts. Das Einsetzen von Sepuyas queeren, weißen Bekannten an die ehemals rassistisch abgewertete Stelle einer handwerklich arbeitenden Person ist eine Form von Sepuyas fotografischer Reflexion solcher gesellschaftlichen Positionierungen. I was going to ask you about your approach to portraiture, which it's very apparent in your work that is something that interests you. And you've said about your work that it's portraits in a sense, but it's like often not picturing like full faces of the people in the pictures. It's not mentioning the names of the people in the titles of the work, not anymore at least. You used to do that in the past. You're not working with the idea of like recognition through a portrait. It's not meant to identify someone. It's more of a trying to find your own approach to portraiture. How would you explain that?
Well, actually, recognition is the key thing, but it's about recognition as a kind of positioning of the viewer. So recognition means that even if a figure is turned and perhaps you only see a portion of their back and catch a bit of a tattoo, or you recognize the way someone's hair falls, or recognition it's not about creating a portrait and then providing information to allow someone who doesn't know the subject to know the subject. But the subject always knows themselves, and anyone who knows the subject, because there's also, I always say that's kind of the horizontal relationship of community around the work. Someone who knows how to enter into the work knows how to navigate it and can make all those sorts of identifications. But the thing with recognition as well, when talking about positioning the viewer, is that people always say the work is very, there's this there's this intimacy, there's this kind of like warmth that maybe is inviting to a viewer, right? There's, in all of the work, there is a kind of like openness and vulnerability, something that I'm like very grateful for friends who participate in the work. But I'm actually interested in positioning the viewer as outside of that. And so not being able to, for example, recognize the subject is saying to the viewer, you have this privilege of viewing this image, but your desire to perhaps enter into that space or have more is, we don't care. You are completely disregarded from that. But if you know your way through, through modes of friendship or community of moving through and alongside people in these spaces, that's the way in. It's not about me giving you information on the wall to say, here's this person, this is why this person is, da-da-da-da-da.
We already talked about intimacy in your pictures, and I feel like out of a lot of your pictures, that just seems to be like oozing out of the picture. It seems like really palpable, it's like textures of skin. You can kind of feel some form of like closeness or even desire in the picture. Is that also part of, you're trying to have both the artist and anyone else in the picture kind of on the same level? There's no hierarchy, it's kind of leveled within the picture.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, actually that's interesting. I don't know if that topic, the way you phrase it, has come up in many conversations recently, but I mean, there is that thing that can happen in work where there is, in a sense, the subject, or even if there's a photographer becomes a subject in the work, that the other subject is still subordinate to the photographer who has a kind of control. There's a strict hierarchy of like who is in control, who is directing, even if, that his hand and his gaze is like that control is there without any give. But I've always been more interested in, it's something I think I realized back from the earliest portraits, like they're very, very tame, very sort of like simple, call them like the kitchen and bedroom portraits, was that I had to, like if I was asking friends to just like sit at the edge of the table or sit on the edge of my bed and sit for a portrait, that I had to do the same thing. So oftentimes I was sitting next to a friend and I would have the camera on a tripod and I would have the cable release. And so I could just be next to the person sort of sitting, and then I would turn the camera to myself or sometimes. But even in these works, like there was an image that was in the show from the first part of this body of work. My friend Zach is naked and he's like reclining kind of like chest down on a pile of pillows on this bench, and I'm entering the frame from outside the frame, and I'm kind of like holding him with my thumb in his mouth. And it's sort of like, it could be it's a kind of image that could imply a kind of power imbalance or a sense of like control over one or the other. But it actually, the thing that I'm interested in those works is that they feel like both subjects depicted are vulnerable in a sense. And I think it's because like, and it's really fun to kind of like, in just like making the work with friends, because it's like also very much interested in like acknowledging and playing with and kind of like amplifying, I think, like aspects of like play and desire that are inherent in a lot of like gay and queer friendships. And so like in that moment, it is like, it requires a double vulnerability. It's like, I can't be outside of the image objectifying him and then creating an image, right? It's like, we have to be like alongside each other.
Yeah. I wanted to talk to you about two things in particular that are in the exhibition, in the current exhibition. You have the darkroom studio part of it, and I feel like there's two parts of that work. There's one thing is the role of the black cloth and also the role of mirrors, and the other is the double entendre of the darkroom that you kind of use in your work, or that you kind of point to. Let's talk about the black cloth, the drape in the studio first. You already mentioned it earlier that it is a thing that has been used in, studios, be it for painting or be it for photography, for decades and decades and decades. In what ways does your use kind of relate or transform that traditional use of the black cloth in the studio?
I mean, in this body of work, I don't think it's not doing that work of trying to kind of transform it. That would be in the project that kind of preceded and kind of turned into this, the darkroom project.
To me, that's funny that you say that, because to me, let's dive right in. Like, you're using the black cloth to make visible things that are usually not visible. Fingerprints on a mirror, like, skinned contact, signs of use and presence of people in your studio. And you're using that black drape or the black cloth exactly for that. And to me, that kind of feels like transforming that thing,
Yes. So all of that is in there. It's become kind of like a background element. It's like it's just something that's still gonna happen, because in an image where I'm photographing the surface of a mirror, you will start to get those traces. So those first ones was just kind of catching how, like, the smudges and things on the surface of the mirror that I was purposefully leaving smudged, because I didn't want the mirror to, I wasn't interested in like illusion, but the way that I noticed that all of the smudges and the fingerprints and things that I thought was really interesting became visible, became much, they were thrown into contrast against the black velvet or my body or the camera. And so that's when I switched from using these various like colored fabrics and the stuff that I was thinking about in reference to like the 1920s to 40s studio photography, and going with the black velvet, and then particularly, black and brown velvets. And then thinking about, okay, well, how has the space behind the backdrop or behind the curtain functioned? And that's what I was thinking, how can I photograph just the surface of the mirror itself? And so that's when I put the camera in the space behind the backdrop, between the backdrop and the mirror, pulling it back just enough to let light through to hit the surface. And then I moved into that space. And then, and so in those, it was all of those images, whether or not they're the ones that are focusing on the fabric and the surface, or there are portraits or bodies in there, it was foregrounding that.
Als traditionelles Element der Porträtfotografie ist der schwarze Vorhang oft nur ein Hintergrund. Der schwarze Vorhang, ein Arbeitsmaterial, das aus der Fotografie nicht wegzudenken ist, wird neben Sepuyas eigener Haut in seinen Fotografien zur Bedingung der Sichtbarkeit von Spuren, die vor weißem Hintergrund unsichtbar bleiben. Das konzeptuelle Potenzial des Schwarzseins wird von Sepuyas Fotografien vor allem über die formale, materielle Ebene, den schwarzen Vorhang und dessen Funktionen aufgezeigt. I think I was like interested in how you initially had that idea. If it was something that you just like, it sounds like it was something that you just discovered kind of by accident, just by rearranging stuff in the studio, and then after you discovered that and you played around with it, or you started working with it, you kind of realize the potential and the
it's I was talking with Alex, the other artist who's showing there last night, and she's like you mentioned something about like accident or chance, but she's like, it's not chance, like you are choosing to observe or to focus on certain things and bring them to the forefront and work with them. I was like, okay, yes, it's like there's elements of what is sort of unscripted or unplanned, but yes, I wanted to use the mirror in a way to reflect as the background of the image, the studio that was always shifting and changing. I didn't want that mirror to be an illusion. So I consciously just stopped cleaning it before I made every image, just to catch imperfections. And then after a while, it was noticing that what I initially thought of as those like imperfections was actually more interesting, but that they were not visible against the vastly white walls of the studio, and that it required something black intervening. And then just kind of sitting with that, but then starting to think about, oh, okay, there's this whole history of needing to move into that space in order to see, using the black velvet as as a background cloth, also I was like, okay, that same material is used for the dark cloth.
Yeah.
That you have to go under to see in the camera obscura, and all these other, so
there's
it's
a lot
just
of layers to it.
It's just like, okay, now and then thinking about how that could really becomes interesting in being able to like reposition how a conversation on like visual and material concepts on race could be addressed in photography, tied to how the medium works rather than through sociological or cultural entry point, which I always found an interesting challenge.
As a journalist or an art critic trying to look at that work, and especially a white journalist or art critic, would be fast to jump to the conclusion that you're trying to make a point here via a sociological perspective on how blackness would function in photography. And what you're saying is kind of not the opposite, but it's different. You're trying to come from a formal perspective, and you're trying to say, look, this is what I'm using, and I'm just like opening up and showing how hidden things like fingerprints or skin traces can be made visible through the blackness of a velvet drape in this case.
It is about, this is how blackness, the reliance, the necessity of elements of black material, how key the representation of black subjects is to the possibility of making images, and how you can look at things through, in a sense, inverting the priorities of an image, that it is those places of like brightness, all of the kind of like value constructions in images. So it's very much about that, and how that's inseparable from photography, in the same way that this other structure of the images is about how desire functions always as a part of the making of images. But the thing that it's not asking to do is the images as an illustration of social conditions. The subjects in the work are black and white and Latinx and Asian and mixed race and, being misidentified racially in the images. Subjects are male, cisgender, trans, female. They may be queer, they may be gay, they may not be. So, I've always been insistent that like the work not be, in a sense, able to define like an identity category for subjects. Mm-hmm. The work, all of the projects, the practice is kind of like that really amazing, like, community run, partially underground, like queer club space. Like the formation of it is around kind of a shared sense of community, of joy, of like all of those things. But many people can enter into it.
Mm-hmm. Was hat die Foto-Dunkelkammer mit dem manchmal in Nachtclubs anzutreffenden Darkroom gemeinsam? Das ist eine der Fragen, denen Paul Mpagi Sepuya in seinen Darkroom-Studio-Arbeiten nachgeht. Hierfür verwandelt Sepuya sein komplettes Studio in einen Darkroom, fotografiert bei Nacht und rotem Licht, sogenanntem Safe Light, das im Prozess der Fotoentwicklung in der Analogfotografie verwendet wird. Auch bei den Darkroom-Studio-Fotografien sind Bekannte von Sepuya im Zusammenspiel mit ihm selbst zu sehen. Im roten Licht, manchmal nackt, manchmal durch das Experimentieren mit Belichtungszeiten verschwommen. In der Ausstellung sind Drucke dieser Fotografien zu sehen, die durch die Anwendung des Thermosublimationsdruckverfahrens eine dreidimensionale Qualität bekommen. Die Darkroom-Studio-Aufnahmen wirken greifbar. Das sogenannte Double Entendre, die Zweideutigkeit des Darkroom als Fotolabor und als Raum für sexuelle Experimente in der Nachtclubkultur und für die queere Community, Dieses Double Entendre und die Wechselwirkung zwischen den zwei Darkrooms, dem fotografischen und dem sozialen, werden von Sepuya in seinem Darkroom Studio erkundet. Let's talk about the darkroom studio works in the exhibition. For your darkroom studio works, you kind of created a darkroom feeling in your daylight studio. So you took those pictures at nighttime using safe light and dye sublimation print then in the end. So the double entendre darkroom, there's the darkroom in photography, and then there's the darkroom that's part of a queer, gay nightlife and bar club culture, where it's like a readily available space, but it's at the same time it's always kind of in the back of a club, or it's kind of like hidden. It is a designated space for public sex, though, and in a more general sense, a space to be able to make certain experiences of touch and of feeling. And if I understand correctly, that's where it kind of relates to the darkroom in photography. How do these two, the darkroom as a public space and the darkroom in photography, tie together for you?
I mean, part of it starts with like literally going through a curtain, but it was that other kind of like accident, or not accident, but like unplanned thing of going from having constructed a dark cloth around the mirror in order to photograph its surface and moving into it. And then that moment when I was explaining how I was making the work to a friend who then asked if he could be in an image, and it's something that I've talked about it a lot, but it was, there was like one picture that came from that of him pulling back the curtain that sort of like introduced it to like there's this inside and outside space, and then the possibilities of, and that's where it was like, oh, okay, this dark room under the dark cloth that I'm creating in order to sort of make these more abstracted type images can also be a social space. So that's where those darkroom images come from, and thinking about just this, the play with that I could make an image that was, that like conceptually and materially in terms of like visual aspects of like how light and color works, trying to get to a root question about photography and what is made visible and how it's made visible, but also tying it in a way that it couldn't be separated from the kind of like total excess of the darkroom as a designated space for shared sexual activity that in a sense makes the making of something formal really impossible. But it was sort of like balancing those two things. But then in these ones, that was, kind of a very specific setup that I was working with. In this, with the use of the illumination from the red lights, was about transforming the entire space into what could be both a dark. It could have functioned as a dark room. I mean, the space doesn't have access to like water in a way that would make the processing of like silver gelatin or anything possible. But like the entire space is transformed into a dark room, but also bodily, kind of like when it becomes a shared space, it's like, and the conditions of light are right, became that dark room. So I was just interested in moving between those two different conditions of illumination and what they allowed for.
So I think I just have maybe like one or two last general questions. I kind of feel like creating images where there's a lot to deconstruct that don't have like one linear thing that they're trying to say is something that is A, like very important to you, but B, also something that you don't like think it through. It's just the way you work, kind of. Would you say that's something that important to you?
Yeah, there's always more in the picture than I can plan. I mean, that's just like the way that the spaces work. That's just because I'm not coming into an empty space every time I'm going to make a picture and being like, okay, this prop, go take a picture, then take it down, right? It's just like, it's so for that reason, there's always going to be other kinds of things kind of like brought in. Yeah. Yeah.
And the other thing is that's kind of tied to that is it seems like you're kind of, almost shifting the center or even like not having a center in a picture. You know, it's like trying to get away from that. I said linear before, but now I was thinking about like how a lot of photos that we see in just, media there's always like a center that's fixed kind of. Mm-hmm. And you're not using that. Your work is kind of not trying to create a center. Do you know what I mean? Is that something that you could relate to?
Yeah, I mean, I think the easy way of saying that is like I'm always more interested in what's happening on the edges of the picture. And I think that's every photographer should start with composition by thinking about what's leaving the frame instead of just putting at the center the thing that they're looking at. Because then that's not a very interesting picture.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
That's my tip for every photographer. Don't put things in the middle of the picture.
I think that's very good advice. Very, very solid advice. Das war eine neue Folge von Das ist Kunst, dem Podcast der Deichtorhallen Hamburg in Zusammenarbeit mit Byte FM. Wenn ihr Lob und Kritik habt, könnt ihr uns gerne schreiben, und zwar an dasistkunst@deichtorhallen.de. Wir freuen uns über euer Feedback. Ich bin Friederike Herr und sage Tschüss, wenn ihr mögt, bis zum nächsten Mal.